Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Laura Bush.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Good evening and welcome to Engage at the Bush Center, presented by Highland Capital Management, and I'm very grateful to Highland Capital Management. As a former teacher and librarian, tonight's program is one of my favorites, our annual Laura Bush Book Club. Thanks to those of you who have joined us in person, and welcome to those of you who are watching our live stream tonight. We hope to host you at the Bush Center in person sometime soon. I'd like to recognize a special group of librarians and educators that are here tonight. They represent the schools that have received grants from the Laura Bush Foundation for America's Libraries. These grants have helped their schools and other needy schools expand, update, and diversify their book and print collections. The Laura Bush Foundation has opened grant applications for the 2021-22 school year. So if you know of a school that could use an updated library collection, please visit www.bushcenter.org LBF to apply. Are the librarians here? Can they stand up if they are? We'll see them back there. Thanks, y'all. And now for the real reason you've joined us tonight, to hear from our featured author and New York Times bestseller, Gayle Lemmon. Gayle's most recent bestseller, The Daughters of Kobani, tells the unforgettable story of an all-female militia that battled ISIS in northeastern Syria in 2014. While bravely fighting for their community, they advanced women's equality around the world. Ashley's War is a gripping combat narrative that shares shocking accounts of an all-female special operations team and the remarkable hero at its heart, First Lieutenant Ashley White. And Gayle's debut novel, The Dressmaker of Khair Khana, tells the story of a young Afghan entrepreneur whose business created jobs and hope for women in her neighborhood during Taliban years. Desperate to support her 5 brothers and sisters and banished from Kabul streets by the Taliban, teenage Camilla Siddiqui started a dressmaking business in her living room, which provided work for 100 women in her neighborhood. Camilla represents the strength and courage of the Afghan people, especially the women. And as we watch the tragic events unfolding in their country, we can be hopeful in Afghanistan's resilience and desire for peace. I was first exposed to Afghanistan in the 6th grade. My teacher assigned a country report, and I picked Afghanistan, not because I knew much about it, but because I wanted to pick a country that seemed remote and interesting. I could have never guessed that 40-something years later, the world's spotlight would turn to Afghanistan, and my focus as First Lady would be to support the women and children there. My first trip to Afghanistan in 2005, only the second time a First Lady has ever visited an active combat zone. There, I announced the establishment of the American University in Afghanistan, an institution that opened with 50 students and has since graduated thousands, with nearly half of the alumni female. Sadly, that university has been taken over by the Taliban. I went back a couple more times as First Lady, and my message was always the same: to ensure the women of Afghanistan that we stand with them. And 15 years later, we still do, even as our hearts break with the resurgence of the Taliban. At a recent speech, our esteemed author, Gayle Lemmon, said that suffocated opportunity is the enemy of global stability. We must spread opportunity to build a world that's more prosperous, more stable, and more secure for all of us. So tonight's program will be twofold. Gayle will be joining us virtually to talk about her best-selling books, and we've expanded our usual book club conversation to include a panel of Afghan experts. Roya Mahboob is an Afghan native and entrepreneur who was among the first tech CEOs in Afghanistan. In 2013, Roya was named to Time magazine's list of 100 most influential people in the world for her work in building internet classrooms. She was a member of our Presidential Leadership Scholars class of 2019, and her story and her portrait are included in George's newest book and special exhibit that's here at the Bush Center, Out of Many, One. Matt Zeller, our third panelist, deployed to Afghanistan in 2008 as an Army captain. During a firefight with the Taliban, his Afghan interpreter saved his life. A former CIA analyst, Matt works today as a consultant and an advocate in Washington, D.C., dedicated to helping the Afghan people. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Natalie Ganella-Platts, the director of the Women's Initiative here at the Bush Center, and our in-house Afghanistan expert. So please join me in welcoming Gayle, Roya, Matt, and Natalie.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, Mrs. Bush, for the incredible welcome. We are thrilled to have you here tonight to not only talk about the fantastic work of Gayle Lemmon, but also the very timely and current events going on in Afghanistan. Gayle, we're really excited to see you. I'm sorry you couldn't be with us in person. There's never a Zoom meeting without audio challenges, right?
Oh my gosh, of course. How many moons in do you think that I could have unmuted in time? I was so worried that small voices would come and interrupt us.
It keeps it relative, right?
At this point. Exactly. It's a true privilege and pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry the circumstances beyond my control prevented me from being there in person, but I'm certainly honored to be there in spirit and to be with each of you. Obviously, thank you for having me, and of course, Roya and Matt, people who have really exercised the privilege of lifting others' voices and from whom I've learned a lot. So thank you so much, and of course, Bush, thank you.
Well, Gayle, you're very much included in that. It is an absolute honor to be on stage tonight with three incredible advocates for human dignity. And I want to start with you and your work, because from Dressmaker to Ashley's War to Daughters of Kobani, all of your work focuses on the untold stories at the intersection of women, peace, and security. Why did you choose to focus in this way, and why does it matter, especially right now?
You know, I grew up in a community of single moms. So my mom was a union worker. She sold Tupperware at night and worked at the phone company during the day. That was in the time when there was a phone company. And really, she taught me all about counting the uncounted. You know, I grew up in a community that was largely invisible to fancy folks in fancy rooms. And it really taught me the urgency of seeing everyone and the power of potential in each one of us. You know, I think it's that whole exercise of counting the uncounted, seeing stories that are invisible, and realizing that if you want to talk about stability and security, you can't do that without women.
It's a really incredible point, because, you know, we've come a long way in the last 20 years, you know, Security Council Resolution 1325, all the way up to the Women, Peace, and Security Act here in the United States, literally codified into law. We prioritize the status of women and girls. Unfortunately, our actions don't always match our advocacy, but what I love about your writing is that you very much seek out those stories and advocate for the representation that is so critical to creating a peaceful, prosperous world. So I want to jump into Daughters of Kobani on that thread. You know, it's really a remarkable read, largely because, you know, the women at the heart of the story are marginalized across every facet of their lives. Their gender, you know, they're also Kurds in Syria. You know, for those who are not as familiar with the YPJ, and specifically the Women's Protection Unit of the YPJ, could you summarize a little bit about why this story is so remarkable?
Sure. This story is really about the women who took on the Islamic State. And these are women who were rewriting the rules that governed their lives at a time when I think that is the theme that so much of the work is about, right? The work that we're all talking about is, I didn't create the rules that say I can't do this or that, right? And that say I can't live up to my full potential, that I don't have agency in my life. And what was incredible to me is what were the odds that a fighting force that had women and this notion coming from Abdullah Öcalan, who was in prison in Turkey, who had written extensively that the Kurds could not be free until women were free. What were the odds that ideology would then come up against the men of the Islamic State, for whom, the buying and selling of women was also central to their ideology? And this really is a privilege to share the story of women who had just incredible courage, because in their view, they were, as one of them told me once, writing our own history now. And it was this kind of David versus Goliath story in which David also happened to be a woman.
I love at the very start of the book, you have a Marcus Aurelius quote, that the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. And I think it's a really important quote for this panel, and we'll certainly come back to those themes as we talk to Roya and Matt a little bit later. But I want to talk a little bit about your own leadership journey before we dive in more fully on Afghanistan. So from Afghanistan to Syria to Iraq and everywhere in between, you have seen firsthand the impact of conflict on women and children, who often bear the majority burden of conflict. And what has it taught you personally? And how has it changed, your approach to your writing or how you think about your own leadership journey?
Oh, it's changed everything. I think, you see the grace and the dignity and the quest, the universal quest for dignity on the ground in places that people don't know, for all of the amazing moms and dads and teenagers who get up every single day and fight for their future. They fight for their future against incredibly long odds, with strength and with courage and with resilience. And so rarely do we get to see them, especially if they happen to be women. We must see women's stories as universal. We must see the notion of the quest for human dignity not belonging to any one country, any one neighborhood, any one ethnic group. This is all about people on the ground. This is never about foreigners. This is all about people on the ground, people I've had the privilege, deep privilege, of spending time with as they push forward every single day and fight for a future that is full of opportunity, the chance for education, the chance for peace, the chance to go to work, that is critical to creating a different future for them and for their people and for their country.
Well, I couldn't have asked for a better way to queue up this next part of the conversation. And, this month marks the 20th anniversary of Mrs. Bush's radio address. It's the first time anyone other than the U.S. president gave the address in its entirety. It's the first time a first lady gave the presidential radio address. And Mrs. Bush used the opportunity to encourage the world to stand in solidarity with Afghan women. So 20 years later, we'd like to play an excerpt of that address because it'll be important to the next part of our conversation especially.
Afghan women know through hard experience what the rest of the world is discovering. The brutal oppression of women is a central goal of the terrorist. Long before the current war began, the Taliban and its terrorist allies were making the lives of children and women in Afghanistan miserable. 70% of the Afghan people are malnourished. 1 in every 4 children won't live past the age of 5 because health care is not available. Women have been denied access to doctors when they're sick. Life under the Taliban is so hard and repressive, even small displays of joy are outlawed. Children aren't allowed to fly kites. Their mothers face beatings for laughing out loud. Women cannot work outside the home or even leave their homes by themselves. Muslims around the world have condemned the brutal degradation of women and children by the Taliban regime. The poverty, poor health, and illiteracy that the terrorists and the Taliban have imposed on women in Afghanistan do not conform with the treatment of women in most of the Islamic world, where women make important contributions in their societies. Only the terrorists and the Taliban forbid education to women. Only the terrorists and the Taliban threaten to pull out women's fingernails for wearing nail polish. The plight of women and children in Afghanistan is a matter of deliberate human cruelty carried out by those who seek to intimidate and control. All of us have an obligation to speak out. We may come from different backgrounds and faiths, but parents the world over love their children. We respect our mothers, our sisters, and daughters. Fighting brutality against women and children is not the expression of a specific culture. It's the acceptance of our common humanity, a commitment shared by people of goodwill on every continent. The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women.
Unfortunately, a lot of those realities are now once again current. And I realize that we all come from different points of understanding on what's going on in Afghanistan. So I think it's always really important to level set so we're all very aware of what's happening on the ground. Since the events of the last few months, 95% of households in Afghanistan are now food insecure. By the middle of summer next year, they believe the poverty rate will basically encompass 97% of the population. Looking again at food insecurity, half of all under fives are at risk of severe acute malnutrition. They predict that between now and the end of December of this year, 1 million children will die if they do not receive adequate treatment. The economy is essentially on the verge of collapse. The healthcare system has all but collapsed. 87% of the healthcare infrastructure, clinics, hospitals, et cetera, are inaccessible to Afghans. Doctors, nurses have not been paid for months. Educators have not been paid for months. Already with one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, which was halved over the last 20 years, we are facing another 51,000 maternal deaths between now and 2025. There is a looming civil war just because of the instability, some of the instability and power dynamics that exist within the current Taliban leadership. And then women and adolescent girls have essentially been excluded completely from public life. So what has happened in terms of Afghanistan over the last few months very much parallels the reality that Mrs. Bush described in her radio address. And that is why it is vitally important that we do not look away, because what happens around the world matters to us here at home. And I think one of the most important questions that we need to start out with, and Mrs. Bush's radio address, I think, exemplifies this. Gayle, in rereading the first few chapters of The Dressmaker, it was a haunting experience because it literally was a parallel to today. I want each of you to weigh in. Do you think the Taliban has changed? I mean, that is a question that, a lot of the media is asking, and you all come at this conversation from different perspectives. So Roya, I would love to get your take on that first.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's absolutely a pleasure to speak here. I have to mention that in 1996, I still remember when Taliban took over our city in Nimruz, and the next day they came into every houses and they collected the books and TVs and set them in the fire. And I still remember from my window that we saw that the freedoms and everything that we liked, it's set on the fire. I mean, I lost my youngest sister during the Taliban because my parents, my father and brother were not at the home, and based on the Sharia law of Taliban, the woman cannot go outside. My mom couldn't take my youngest sister outside to take it to the doctor, and the next day we lost our sister. And that was the moment that my mom says is enough, and we returned back to Iran. And in 2003, we're back again to Afghanistan. I think that today the contents that the Taliban has changed, the society that the Taliban used to run it is changed. The expectation and attitude of Afghans towards about the respect to the women and access to education for the children and also for the young girls are changed. So they face a new reality with new generation. 60% of our population live under 25, and this generation either born during the time of Taliban or they're born after the Taliban. They're raised with access to information, freedom of speech, they access to cell phones and access to anything that they want. They could talk, they could be against of anything that former governments, if they do anything wrong, they could do protest it, they go to social media. And I don't think that Taliban can bring back us to 1990s. It would be difficult, but I believe on this younger generation that they are different than my parents' generation, and I think that this generation will force Taliban to be changed. And I think that at the beginning would be difficult. We already saw that the Taliban, the first thing that they have done it, they didn't allow the girls and women again not go to the schools, not come into the work. And they right now changed their tones, and they say that they will allow the girls come to the schools, but it's not clear when. So I think that we still have to continue to advocating for those millions of the young generation that right now they are not have access to the schools and education or not have access to the work, the basic rights that a human can have.
Matt, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Well, first, thanks again, Rabbi, and to Mrs. Bush for inviting us. It's a mixed bag. I still say that they're the same evil Taliban that they've always been. They're just, it's not, Afghanistan is not the collapsed state that it was in the 90s, so it's actually worse. The Taliban that embody all of the important ideology and worldview that we all came to unify against, after the events of 9/11, but this time they're not inheriting a collapsed state in which, there's basically ruins. They're inheriting a country that we spent the last 20 years rebuilding. And so forgive the military and me from coming out, but how I think of this is that they inherited the entirety of the Afghan military that they basically took over, to include an air force. So this Taliban has more helicopters than the nation of Australia. They're the largest air force in the region, comparatively speaking, compared to the rest of its neighbors, in terms of helicopter capability. They've got armed drones. They have a really phenomenal understanding of how to use social media and the internet, and they're savvy about it, right? They understand that that their perspective to the rest of the world, how the rest of the world views them, will dictate aid that comes their way, and that they're still dependent on aid. And so if there's one thing that I think that might be to our advantage here is, I agree with Roya, they're not going to be able to take Afghanistan back to the 90s. The genie is out of the bottle, right? Too many people experienced freedom for the last 20 years. The real question now becomes is, can the Taliban find a way to be moderated? And I think the only way that I see hope for that is actually in the Afghan women, the women who spent the last 20 years building from nothing a better future and are now determined to not just let that be squandered.
I often summarize it as this, Afghan women in 2001, they were starting from, well behind the starting point of a lot of other women who were seeking to advance their status in society. But what they achieved in 20 years is actually more than most women's movements achieved across multiple decades. And it's really a testament to the potential and the possibilities that exist among the Afghan people. Gayle, I want to turn the question a little bit, because I know you're equally as passionate about the status of the younger generation in Afghanistan. And rather than, let's not talk anymore about the Taliban, let's move on to, really the brightness and the boldness of the Afghan people. What gives you hope knowing that this generation of Afghans and the mass of this generation of Afghans represents for the future?
What gives me hope is the people who struggle every single day for something better. And it is the younger generation, right, that is pushing against a great number of obstacles, but is truly making a difference. And I think that the need for dialogue is real and urgent. And if you look at what is happening, 18 to 19 million women and girls are going to be living under the Taliban. More than 90% of the country is facing hunger. How do we help get those healthcare workers get paid? How do we help teachers get income? How do we help women and girls live lives of dignity? Because last time around in the Taliban, women started businesses, they ran schools, they taught Microsoft Office. Roya knows all of this so well, right? Women never waited for the world to remember them. And the question now is, will the world stand with them as they push forward, no matter what happens? And that, I think, is really for the world to engage, to find a path to dialogue, and to figure out how to help get aid and cash directly into the hands of Afghan people, many of whom haven't gotten paid since May.
I think that's a fantastic segue then to talk about the Afghan Girls Robotics team, who built a ventilator out of car parts. But Roya is the founder and the biggest cheerleader of the Afghan Girls Robotics team, and they are truly a force. They just won the Judges Award during their most recent competition, and they're basically transplanted to Doha over the last couple months. Roya, please tell us a bit more about your girls, and really, why are investments in young women and adolescent girls so incredibly important, especially right now?
Well, in 2017, George Sestak, former president of First Global, contacted me, and he told me that if I have a team of teenagers that they can participate at First Global Challenges robotic competitions, that they invited many of the countries to come. And I told him I'm not sure about the robotics, because robotics is very new in my country. I know that a few professors at the University of Polytechnic they use, but I'm not sure about the teenagers. He said that either find me a team or build a team. So I decided to build a team, and then we decided to build all girls team, because this definitely sent a message for the girls in Afghanistan, also the women in the world. We built a team with 6 students. They couldn't get the visa, and then we used the social media to telling our stories. And these stories reached out to 53 US congressmen that they signed a petition, and the last minute, former President Trump granted the girls to get the visa and come to the competition. When they win the silver medal of the courageous achievement at that competitions, we saw the changes is happening with our communities. And we decided this light to be shining. And we took the team to different other stages, and we trained them, and they win many of the competitions, and they're becoming the symbol of hope and unity in Afghanistan. They captivated the eyes of the public with their inspiring message of determination and hope. And during the pandemic, as you mentioned, the girls decided to help the community with the skills that they trained, and they started building an open source ventilator out of the car part, but the design was based on the design that MIT gave to them. And they also not build a ventilator, they build a couple of other robots, the sanitizer robots and spray robots. They build in computer games, and in fact, with giving this chance to these young girls to bringing this prototype innovation and bringing back to the community, we could change the lives of the women and children throughout Afghanistan, and they could becoming the master of their own destiny. And they not only changed the view of the men's on the women's abilities in science and technology, but in fact, they also were allowed that the former government of Afghanistan to invest on the building the Dreamer Institute, that what was a plan to be a school of the STEM education, that they trained the next generation of the young leaders in the science, technology, and many other industries. So whenever I think about them, it's just about if you're giving these dreamers tools and an opportunity that they can build their dreams, no one can stop them. During the evacuation, we brought them to Doha. The first thing that they sent me a message that they were very upset because they didn't have their CubeSat, because they were part of a competition. For 1 month, they worked from July, and they built one of the robots. We brought them to Kabul. And when they arrived in Kabul, we were looking for getting the visa for them. We couldn't get the visa, but the evacuation happened. Government collapsed, and then Qatari governments helped us with evacuated of these girls. I thought that they might be upset about the family stock, but the first thing they told me that they forgot to bring their CubeSat and how they can continue their computation. So we talked with the First Global to send them on a CubeSat, and they, they compete and they could get the Judges Award, which is just give us a hope because they are the symbol of the younger generation. If we're giving investment on the young girls and women, and especially on STEM education, we unlike multi-generational potential of the young women could have. And if the women and girls participated in the workforce, the poverty rates goes down and economies grows. And it's so important that we are teaching our young generation, especially young girls, about and prepare them for the future jobs, because within the next 10 to 15 years, maybe many of the jobs that right now the women in our countries in South Asia are working, they might be gone by robots and AI. And it's so scary to look at the future. Unfortunately, we are so behind of the world. And I go into conferences here, they're talking about planted the tomatoes and vegetables in Mars. And it's so sad that today I have to sitting here and we're discussing about the rights of the having access to education, simple rights for women and young girls. And it's so sad that in 2021, we have to discuss with men, again, with extremists, that it's a right of the human to have access to, education, works, health. And I don't know what happened, but the one thing that we know is that we cannot forget about millions of the young generation that are still in Afghanistan.
Well, women do not allow us to fail, and I think the Dreamers, your Afghan Girls Robotics team, is really a testament to that. So folks know there are a number of students who, as Roya mentioned, made it to Doha. The Qatari government graciously granted them scholarships for high school, but want to put on notice just the US university system. They all will be looking for placements in a couple years' time. And again, they built a ventilator from car parts. So, and they're like 16. So, but Roya, you bring up a really good point in terms of the evacuation. You mentioned visas, and so that's why I want to turn to Matt now. Your work in support of the SIV population and now the broader population of at-risk Afghans is deeply, deeply personal. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your own personal journey in all of this and the work you're doing now that is so vitally critical and needs all of us to continue to move it forward.
Sure. So I shouldn't be sitting here talking to any of you tonight. I should be dead and buried at Arlington Cemetery in DC. The reason why I'm not is because on the 14th day of my war, on April the 28th, 2008, my Afghan interpreter saved my life in a battle in which he shot and killed 2 Taliban fighters who were about to kill me. I made him a promise that if I could ever repay that life debt, all he had to do was ask. The next morning when I found a meeting, breakfast is actually when I made that promise. And I'd be remiss if I didn't share this because it's really what illuminated my eyes into just how important Afghan women were to everything. He was sitting by himself at a breakfast table, and you have to understand, I had met this guy once prior to him saving my life. It had been in a receiving line 10 days before the battle in which he would save me. We had said all of basically hello to each other. And yet here was this person who I knew nothing about. I couldn't even really remember his name, if I'm being honest. And yet he was as important to my existence as my parents are. And I didn't know anything about him. So I sat down, and my very first question is, I said to him, you're a real hell of a shot. I'm glad you're on our side, but why'd you do that? Why'd you kill 2 people who are your fellow countrymen to potentially save me? And he said, well, you're a guest in my country. I take the bullet before you. And I said, well, I don't understand then. Why are you on our side and not theirs? And he said, oh, my mom would beat me up if I joined the Taliban. which was not the answer I was expecting. I said, I don't understand. I thought women don't have any rights here. And he goes, well, you know nothing of Afghans. I said, you're right. Will you teach me? Okay. First lesson. Afghan men can't fight without the blessings of their mothers. I'm like, wait, are you telling me that everybody on the other side of yesterday's battle had mom's permission to be there? He said, yeah, they did. I said, what makes your mom so much different than their mom? Why is your mom so much more enlightened? He goes, oh, that's simple. My mom can read and write for herself. She's read the Quran. She knows what they preach is in Islam. She forbade me from ever joining them. And then he got really serious. He looked me right in the eye and he said, why do you think it is that they burn down schools for girls and women? It's because they fear an Afghanistan filled with moms like mine, because that's when their movement dies. I went to my boss immediately after that and I said, sir, if we're going to have any success here, we got to start teaching the girls how to read and write. We built 2 elementary schools, a middle school, and a high school. I don't know if they're still in existence, but that's my hope for Afghanistan. I made him a promise that if I could ever repay that debt, all he had to do is ask. And long story short, it took a number of years. I got him over here, and we learned firsthand just how difficult it was to get him out. And the resources that I raised to help him get his new life started, he refused to take. He insisted that we use it to start a foundation to help others who were in similar duress. And that was 8 years and some, at this point, 70,000 people ago. It's hard. I had a list of 23 names I was trying to help get out of Kabul. I got 5. It's a batting average of 217. It's not a good batting average, by the way. I'd be sent down to the minors with that. But 18 of those people who are still left behind are members of my own family, of the gentleman who saved my life. They're all on hit lists because of his service. The reason why this is so important, the so what all of this is very simple. I shouldn't be sitting here talking to any of you. And the only reason I am is because an Afghan man believed that we're honorable people, that we keep our word. If you ask him why it is that he served that's his picture, by the way, of him getting sworn in as a U.S. citizen last summer. He signed up because he believed that the Taliban are a virus. That's how he calls them. He said they're a virus, that it's our responsibility as Afghans to help mitigate. He also signed up to work with us because he believed that we were honorable people who kept their word. And what we told him was that if he gave a certain quality of service for a certain time, and then if he found himself in duress because of that, that we had his back, just the way that they had ours. And my fear is this. In the military, we're taught 2 things at basic training from the get-go. We don't leave anybody behind on the battlefield, and we're supposed to leave it better than we found it for the next people. I am the 9th generation of my family to wear this country's uniform at war. I have a daughter. I don't know if she'll follow in our family's tradition of service, but if she does, I'd like to hope that she has just as good of a chance at living as I did. And the only way I know how to ensure that is we have to keep this promise now. Because if we don't, why would anyone ever trust us again? I fear that in the next war, my brothers and sisters who go off to serve our country won't have their Janice watching their back. And that the only way we know how to ensure that their Janice is watching over them is to make sure that Janice and everyone else like him, who we made a promise to, is brought home. So that's why I keep doing what I'm doing, and that's why this will probably take the better part of the rest of my life. Because
Well, and it's not just about our allies. Our adversaries are watching too. The Taliban have already taken, a page out of the tyrant's playbook. Cutting off access to education in this circumstance, it's specifically in terms of access to education for women and girls. But you look at every nefarious actor over the course of history, from the Nazis to the Soviets to the Khmer Rouge, in one way or another, they restricted access to education. So just as they're taking a page from that playbook, they're also adversaries everywhere are paying attention to how we engage and we respond to what's happening in Afghanistan right now. Gayle, amid all of this, I will never forget in the Washington Post you wrote, you've never felt so powerless to help. I'm paraphrasing, some of the most, powerful, just empowered women you've ever met. And, from where you sit and being such an advocate on the topic of women, peace, and security and telling women's stories, Matt is obviously helping in terms of getting everyone we can out, but what are other ways that we can help?
I think, I'd also love to hear Roya's view on this, but I would say a couple of things. One is there are local NGOs working with folks on the ground, working with Afghan women and girls who need support, right? Especially as things get more and more dire on the ground. It's really important. Secondly, is to push for engagement, to care, right? I mean, it's so desperately important that people continue to engage, that people continue to want to do something to stand with women who have stood for their communities. And the second piece of that, and I think corollary to that, is to help those who we have had the privilege of helping to reach the United States and other countries. This is our work, and it really is up to each and every one of us to make sure that those who do come to this country are welcomed, are embraced, and are brought into society in the most fulsome way possible. And I guess finally, I would say we have the power to make a difference, but to exercise it, we have to recognize it. And it's really important that each one of us realize we have the power to support those who are fighting for dignity, whether they're in Afghanistan today, whether they're in Atlanta, whether they're on a military base transitioning to the United States, whether in a country like Albania, working to figure out what their next step is. What binds us is so much more powerful than what separates us, and it really is up to each of us.
Roya, what would you like to add to that?
Thank you, Gayle, for mentioning all of those great advice, but I also wanted to say that these refugees who are coming out is not only looking for a better lives, but they are the soul of Afghanistan, that they went to exile. They are the journalists. These people are judges, the professors, and they are human rights activists that they have been working all these years, within the last 20 years. And they had the best hope for their nations. And unfortunately, right now we are in a situation that they are going to the exile, but it's important that we can welcoming them and providing the resources for employment opportunities, language training, and also the culture training for these refugees, but also giving them a chance that they can contribute to American dreams. And one day they might be able to back to the country and they can rebuild their countries.
So Gayle and Roya, I want to come back to you in your immigrant journeys, but first, Matt, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the evacuation effort and what transpires between evacuation to final resettlement. And one thing I think everyone should know, that right now, you cannot get out of Afghanistan if you do not have a visa. But you cannot get a visa to the United States, the UK, anywhere in Europe, Canada, Australia, until you are out of Afghanistan. So already the odds are stacked impossibly against you, but people make it. They're then stuck in this flux period of, and Matt, please add further to this, of about 12 to 24 months before they will get to the United States. It may be shorter if they're going elsewhere. And then on top of that, they have to begin to rebuild their lives. That is a Herculean effort in and of itself. But in terms of the economic crisis in Afghanistan as well, most of these folks have zero access to any of their assets. Whether they're credit cards, whether they're savings, whether they're checking accounts, nothing. So they're essentially leaving with the clothes on their backs and whatever money they're able to withdraw before they cross the border or get on a flight out of Afghanistan. So Matt, enlighten us a little bit more. Why is this so hard, and what are some of the common misconceptions around the visa process and the common barriers with the visa process right now in Afghans?
Simply put, the visa program was written for a world that doesn't exist anymore. It literally is written into law that to get a special immigration visa, you have to do an in-person interview at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. There's not an embassy in Kabul anymore. Like we're going to have to fundamentally change the law. There have been a lot of interesting innovations that have actually developed in terms of immigration around the Afghan evacuation. The first use ever of what's called an electronic visa or an e-visa. It used to be that you actually had to physically go to the embassy and they'd put a visa in your passport. Well, as the country was collapsing, we moved the embassy to the airport and took all of the Afghan passports that were in our possession with us. If you were an Afghan who had submitted your, I knew many Afghans who they were waiting just to simply have their passport handed back to them so they could book their plane ticket, and then suddenly they couldn't get out because we were physically in possession of that passport. One of the other interesting innovations is that for years, people in the greater immigration resettlement world have been asking for the United States to adopt a system that's used in a lot of other countries in which private individuals and organizations can sponsor specific families for resettlement. That's never been done before until now. So last week, the White House announced something called the Sponsor Circle Initiative. You can go to sponsorcircles.org if you're interested, but what it takes is 5 Americans can choose to come together as a group. You have to undergo a background investigation, and then there's some initial training, and you have to raise, I think it's like $2,700 per family, but they will then pair you with a family that's geographically going to be resettled in an area near to you. And this is actually a really wonderful thing, because what we've learned throughout the years is that, particularly when it comes to the interpreters who worked alongside the U.S. military, the faster that you can pair those individuals with veterans, the better off that the resettlement is. So here's what we're facing. You've got a block of people who are in Afghanistan right now. There's about 185,000 of them that got left behind. 85,000 of them are the interpreters and their family members. We only actually evacuated about 2,700 interpreters and family members of the 125,000 people who were brought out. The other 100,000 that remain left behind are people like women, civil society leaders, artists, people who just have no future in the Taliban-held Afghanistan. We need a basically comprehensive immigration reform and an actual policy that obligates the United States to withdraw these people. There's nothing in law that obligates us to do this whatsoever. It's done. We've left Afghanistan, the war is over. What at least the greater veterans community is trying to push for is a permanent policy that extends the same thing we have with the Cuban people, a wet foot, dry foot policy, where if you're an eligible Afghan who needed evacuation and you can somehow get to any US territory in the world, we're obligated to take you in. But then for the population that got evacuated, and so let's just break the numbers down. 125,000 people get flown out by the United States in the 2-week period in August. It's the largest airlift in human history. Of that 125,000, 65,000 are Afghans. The other 60,000 are actually Americans, Europeans, and others that we were able to evacuate as well. Of those 65,000 Afghans, half are children. Let's just start there. They all came with the clothes that they were wearing the day they walked onto the airport in Kabul. They don't have luggage. It's winter. Winter is coming. None of them have winter clothing. I've been to Fort Dix, Quantico, Fort Lee, and Fort Pickett, and I can tell you that these people need everything. They need every bit of assistance as possible. Most of them don't have permanent status in the United States. They're going to be what's called humanitarian paroled into the US. Humanitarian parole is the legal category that you're assigned when you're seeking asylum. So none of these people's permanent residency is even assured. They could be deported at any time back. Now, they can't be deported back to Afghanistan under US law, but they could be sent elsewhere. The reality is this. Most of these people are going to end up staying in the United States. They're not a threat. They're just looking for a better life. They're not coming here, by the way, to take our jobs. They're coming to create them. If you meet these people, I'm going to tell you right now, they're some of the most industrious people you ever meet in your life. But What they need now more than anything is you. They were our cultural ambassadors and bridges to the world around us, for those of us who served over there. They now need you to be that to them. And I promise you this, if you welcome these people into your lives, if you get to know them, you can't help but fall in love with them. I've never met another people who have absolutely nothing and yet will give you everything. If you welcome them into your lives, if you choose to meet these people and really get to know them, I promise you, they're gonna be at your Thanksgiving dinner table. And you're gonna end up joining them for a meal that's called iftar, which is the meal that you use to break fast during Ramadan. They will transform your community and you, and for the better. And I can't wait for the American people to get to meet these people. I can't wait for them to get off the bases where they're all being held at right now, because they're just some of the most inspiring and wonderful human beings on the planet. And I'm so deeply proud to be able to call them our future and newest Americans. They've earned the right to be here.
Thank you.
Last question, and we have an exhibit next door called Out of Many One, which speaks to the fact that we are a nation of immigrants, and the Afghan people stood with us when we needed them most. And we happen to be sitting with one of the featured individuals in that exhibit. Her portrait is absolutely stunning, and you may have seen her if you've been driving down Greenville Avenue, because she's on one of the tent poles. But Roya, just to close this out, what was it like to be painted by a US president? Real quick.
I mean, it's very poetic to see that President Bush printed me. I never imagined in my life that it's happened. And I think that I'm very humbled and honored that I have this opportunity. But I have to say that President Bush is the one person that is a hero of my life, that brings lights in the darkness lives that me and millions of other my generation had. He is the reason that he and Ms. Bush, they are the reason that Afghanistan's transformed. We had 2 decades of the golden era in whole history of Afghanistan, that we had access to. I mean, we had human rights, democracy, and women empowerment is happening. We build the schools, we build Americans build the schools, the roads and the hospitals.
Afghans were there right alongside us. So
we did it together.
We did it together.
But thanks to you guys, I mean, my society is transformed a lot, and it wasn't impossible if President Bush didn't decide to come to Afghanistan. The last thing that I wanted to mention is the terrorism and extremists are diseases. And this is as a cancer that is caused by poor education, lack of the economic opportunities, and poverty are the reason. And like many other diseases, it could be prevented by underlining these factors. And it's about that giving this opportunity and giving aid, humanitarian aid and foreign aid should not be weaponized, but actually it should giving to the citizen and making sure that they are well-being of citizen and advancing of the health of the citizen too, making sure that they are not be radicalized, because if we give that chance, we have right now 60% of the population, very young population, and it's very dangerous. And we have to making sure this not happen again. But thank you again, Bush and President Bush, for giving us the era that I don't know if the next generation will see it, but I'm really lucky to was part of these 20 years, and I use this opportunity for my life, and hopefully that we're making sure that the new generation of Afghanistan have it, and we will fight for that.
You're amazing, Roya.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, an hour goes by really quickly when you have such incredible panelists. So I first and foremost want to thank Gayle, Roya, and Matt for joining us tonight and for their incredible contribution to this discussion. So please join me in thanking them. and I want to offer a reminder. I think this conversation was really a testament to the fact that what happens to the people of Afghanistan demonstrates to the world the true value we as Americans place on free and fair societies. Afghans stood with us when we needed them most, and right now, what we all do or do not do will demonstrate both to our allies and our adversaries our commitment to freedom and equity everywhere. So Matt has given us ideas, Roya has given us ideas, Gayle's given us ideas. We even have a resource page that you can go to if you're looking to donate to various organizations, but we can't move forward without you all, and we hope that you will join us in this cause. I would also like to thank Highland Capital Management for endowing the Engage at the Bush Center series. For everyone's awareness, our next event is our family holiday celebration, Merry and Bright Night, on November 18th. You can find information at bushcenter.org. On your way out tonight, please make sure to stop next door and see Roya's incredible portrait. It's one of the largest ones in the exhibit. Please don't leave without stopping there. But out of many, one is our special exhibit on immigration. The permanent exhibit is also open. And as you exit, there will be signed copies of Gayle's newest book, The Daughters of Kobani, on sale in the museum store. All three of her books are fantastic, by the way, so don't just stop at Daughters. Please read them all. And lastly, bushcenter.org/Afghanistan, as I mentioned, is where you can find various resources and how you can contribute here in our local Dallas community. We will add additional resources because I know Matt, as I said, every time I talk to him, you're driving up and down the East Coast, delivering coats and all sorts of other necessities, so we'll be sure to update that with the most relevant information. And thank you all for joining us tonight.